Hey Renee,
Hi Mark, how's it going?
good. We'll take care of that name in a second.
Yes, I was going to say I am not Mark Weicker. I'll
Be
get
glad.
started second. I feel like I'm a little dark here. I'm gonna turn my ring light on.
It really looks okay.
I was on mute again. Well, are we ready to get started? I'm ready to get started if you are, Mark.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, awesome. Well, hi everyone. My name is Renee Stromski. A quick visual description. I am a white woman with long brown curly hair. I have blue eyes and I'm wearing a white shirt with black polka dots. And I have a blue virtual background behind me. And I know it's been a really long day so far, but I hope you guys have found today's sessions as engaging and informative as I have. And with my presentation topic today, I think it's a great way to kind of close out our lecture style portion of the conference as we have our Q&A panel coming up next. Throughout the day, we've talked about the laws and the cases that protect students and the rights they have in school. So I'm hoping to use my time today to shift that focus to the students themselves and how we can ensure that students have a meaningful voice in the decisions that affect their education. So we're going to start off with a poll question, and I want everyone to think about the last student meeting that they attended. Who talked during the most during that student-related meeting? And as our poll comes up, I'll give everyone a minute to read the question and submit the response. Feel free to choose the option that best reflects your experience. While you're all voting, I will share a little bit more about myself. Again, my name is Renee Stromski, and I'm a special education attorney with Abner Weicker. I am based in Cleveland, Ohio. For the locals, I am in Lakewood on the west side. For the past 4 years, I've represented students and families in a wide range of educational matters, including special education, student discipline, bullying and harassment, discrimination, residency, enrollment, athletics, transportation, and more. And that's ranging for students as young as preschool to doctoral students. And although the parents are the ones that often hire me, I always remind them that the student is really at the center of everything that we do. So I do want to, can we see the poll answers? It looks like most people said administrator, about 40%, almost half. And then the others that were kind of tied up, where the next one was teacher and then parent and advocate were kind of tied for third. And then really only 3% of the people said the student was the one that talked the most um, during the last student related meeting. So if I can click out of that. Oh, and also one fact about because we have to tell fun facts. One fun fact about me is that I am a certified therapy dog handler and have a big fluffy bear dog, Finley, that I volunteer with around Cleveland. So again, we're talking about today about bringing the student to the center of everything we do. And so when we're doing that, it not only leads to better educational decisions when we include our students' voices in there, but it can also become some of the strongest evidence in a future dispute about that student's education. And that's what really inspired today's presentation, because when you all answered this question, who talked the most? Everyone was saying administrator, parent, teacher, lawyer, advocate. But really, who should have talked the most at the meeting? This presentation is all about challenging us to think about student voice a little bit differently. Every major educational decision is made about students, right? Everyone says students first in their decisions, but not every educational decision is made with students. And this presentation is about changing that. So I think some of my words are a little overlapped up here. I apologize about that. I believe it is supposed to say student voice is bigger than special education. And that is, it says that because when I first proposed this session, and I know it was also on the description as well, we kind of assumed that I would be talking more about students with disabilities and student-led IEP meetings. And while we will absolutely talk about students with disabilities and IEPs, I intentionally titled this presentation Giving Students a Voice in Their Education, because student voice is so much bigger than special education. Think about every educational decision that affects the student's life: an IEP, a bullying investigation, a Title IX complaint, a Title VI complaint, attendance intervention, transition planning, even something as routine as deciding where they sit in the classroom. Every one of those decisions is made by adults, but every one of those decisions affects the student. So the question that I want you to keep asking yourself throughout today's presentation is, whose voice is driving the outcome of these decisions? And again, I want everyone to be thinking about student voice as a civil rights issue. It isn't simply about being a leader or having leadership skills. It's about equity. It is about autonomy. It's about access and belonging. And it's important to remember that meaningful student participation is, again, not unique to special education. Student participation is reflected in the broader principles of procedural fairness, equal access, non-discrimination, and student-centered decision-making found throughout education law. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. And if you see me pulling my hair back, it's because I have a fan next to me in my office, so I apologize for that. So now that we are starting to think a little bit differently about student voice, I want to talk about why student voice matters. And to be able to do that, we have to talk about what is student voice. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about student voice is that it's all or nothing. Either the student is leading their own meeting, or they don't have a voice at all. But really, student voice is a continuum, as you can see on the slide here. Some students are simply being talked about, others are being listened to, consulted with, helping make decisions, and some are ready to help lead those parts of the conversation. And the goal isn't to get every student necessarily to what would be, if this was switched horizontally, it'd be the far right of the continuum. I guess here it's, to the bottom of that continuum. That's not necessarily the goal. The goal is to help every student move forward one step at a time in whatever way is meaningful and appropriate to them. And again, one of the other ways that I do want to challenge everyone's thinking today is that communication is much broader than speech. Every student has a voice. But of course, every student communicates differently, whether it's spoken language, using an AAC device, eye gaze, gestures, communication through writing or artwork using an interpreter, choice board. I mean, the list on here is certainly not excessive. If I were to put every form of communication on here, it would be way too small of a font for everyone to see. So whatever the communication the student is using, it's the responsibility of the adults in the room, whether it's the parents, the administrator, the teacher. It is the adult's responsibility to recognize how each student communicates and then make sure that that voice has the opportunity to be heard. And so again, what does student voice mean? Or what does it actually mean? I think when a lot of people hear student voice, they tend to think that I'm talking about, just making students feel more included, or making the meetings more engaging for them. And don't get me wrong, those are great goals, but to me, student voice is more than giving them a chance to speak or giving students a chance to speak. It's making sure that their experiences, their goals, their concerns, and their preferences are all meaningfully influencing the educational decisions that the adults are making. So again, student voice isn't measured by how much a student talks. Again, we have many forms of communication. It's measured by whether what the student communicates is actually shaping the outcome. And of course, we have to remember that a student's attendance at a meeting doesn't automatically mean that they are participating, and participation doesn't automatically mean that they are having an equal influence in the decisions that are being made. Again, student voice is not just a special education concept. It's not just one event. It's not something that just begins at age 14 or age 16 when transition planning starts, whatever state you live in. It's a way of approaching educational decision making throughout a student's entire school career, whether or not they have a disability. At its core, to me, student voice really just means that the student has that meaningful opportunity to share their experiences, their preferences, any concerns, their goals, their hopes and dreams, and not only ensuring that they have that meaningful opportunity, but to make sure that their perspectives are actually influencing the decisions that the adults are making. It's one thing to give them an opportunity to speak, and another to actually hear them and adjust the decisions moving forward. Why should we care? Student voice helps students develop self-determination. For those of you who haven't heard of the concept of self-determination, it's really self-determine is referring to the skills and knowledge that enable people to direct their own lives. It's really all about skills like goal setting, problem solving, decision making, having self-awareness, being able to self-advocate, and really believing that your choices matter. And those skills don't just appear when students graduate. The students have to learn them through repeated opportunities to be able to make choices and solve problems, and express their preferences and participate in the decisions while they're still in school. And so all of this is important because self-determination is one of the strongest predictors of successful adult outcomes for students with disabilities. Students who develop these skills are much more likely to pursue post-secondary education, obtain competitive employment, live independently, advocate for their own accommodations, earn higher wages, and experience greater autonomy and social engagement as adults. And I do have references for all of that research. But again, that self-determination, it just doesn't show up once they graduate and students are just ready to suddenly be able to do all of these things and engage with these services. Really what we need to do is give those repeated opportunities to make choices and solve problems. And again, one of the most natural places to do that is in the educational planning process itself. So when we're asking students what helps them learn, or when we encourage them to make their own goals, we're doing more than just, improving an IEP or improving a behavior plan. We are helping students develop very critical skills that they will need in college, in future employment, and just throughout adulthood and the rest of their lives. So what does the law require? There's no single law there's no law that says student participation is required in every educational decision. I wish it was, but a lot of the legal frameworks support or depend upon understanding the student's perspective. While these statutes that we're looking at all approach it differently, they all recognize that educational decisions should be individualized, and you can't truly individualize a program without understanding the student's perspective. The IDEA is the most explicit. It requires for example, it requires students to be invited to IEP meetings after age 16. Some states, again, like Ohio, have lowered this requirement to 14. And then there are also sections in the IEP where the IEP team is required to consider a student's strengths, preferences and interests and needs when developing transition services. So again, that's how that meaningful student participation is woven in there. Section 504 and the ADA don't, again, specifically require student participation in that same way that the IDEA does. But they do still require individualized decision-making and equal educational access, which means that teams need to understand how a student's disability affects them in practice. And who better to get the best source of that information from than the student themselves. So while none of these laws specifically use the word student voice, they all reinforce the same underlying principle that better decisions are made when students are able to meaningfully be included in the process. So continuing on the student voice, again, as I've been saying, it extends far beyond disability law. Just some other examples of common laws where we do see that theory of student participation, student voice popping up. In Title IX and Title VI matters. Title IX, I know we learned about earlier from Jess. Title VI is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Hopefully I got that right. It is our race discrimination or our anti-race discrimination law. The student's perspective is often critical for understanding what happened in any of these investigations or any complaints, and the type of impact that it had and any supportive measures or remedies that might be appropriate. And of course, during these processes, students should have meaningful opportunities to be able to share their experiences in a way that is accessible and appropriate for their age and communication needs. And really the takeaway here isn't that every law requires the exact same thing. It's that across educational settings, there's a growing recognition that students should be partners in decisions that affect their education. So now that we've talked about why student voice matters, the next question is, how do students actually learn to advocate for themselves? Like I said before, these skills don't just appear once students graduate. Since we are in the land of education, I'm proposing that we teach student advocacy or self-advocacy the same way that we teach reading. You don't hand a kid Shakespeare before teaching them the alphabet. And in that same manner, we can't just throw a high school student, for example, into an IEP meeting and expect them to lead it if they've never been taught how to ask any questions or express their preferences, understand their disability, or just participate in any decisions about their education at all. These are the different stages of self-advocacy. They are developmental. It's not necessarily chronological, and students don't move through them based solely on age or grade level. It is dependent. Again, it's individualized based on the student. So a high school student might still be learning to identify accommodations, and an elementary school student might be participating in their educational decisions already. The goal here is growth, not reaching a particular stage by a particular age. So that first stage is finding my voice. Students at this stage don't need to understand the law, of course. They need to understand that they have choices and that their opinion matters. And they also need to understand that they can tell adults what helps them. So even something as simple as a teacher asking a student, which pencil helps you write, and the student chooses, or would you rather use headphones or work in the quiet corner, and the student chooses. That in itself is practicing self-advocacy. So a tip for attorneys, just remember that even very young children can provide very valuable information during any type of communication, whether it's sensory assessments, bullying investigations, FBA interviews, or communication evaluations. Before students can advocate for themselves in a meeting or a hearing or even a conversation with the teacher, they first need these foundational skills, those being able to express preferences, recognize and communicate feelings, make choices, and learn that their voice matters. So think of these as the building blocks of self-advocacy that we're trying to develop over the student's educational career. Naturally, the next question is, where do students learn these skills? Again, it's not for students with disabilities, it's not just once a year during an IEP meeting. Self-advocacy can be built through everyday opportunities. I've got some lists there. In general education classrooms, through special education services, and at home as well. Every time a student is invited to make a choice, and be able to reflect on what helps them learn, or even just share their perspective, they are practicing those skills that will prepare them to participate in some of those much bigger educational decisions later on in their lives. And remember again that self-advocacy is not limited to students who communicate through spoken language. Every student can develop self-advocacy skills, but the way they communicate might look different. So regardless of the communication method used, every student's voice still has value. Our job is just to meet them where they are and create opportunities for them to express their preferences and participate in those decisions. The key takeaway here being that finding your voice begins when students learn that their opinions matter, even before they have the words to express their opinions independently. The next stage is knowing my voice. So once students have found their voice and learn that their thoughts and choices matter, the next step is helping them understand themselves. And that's where this next stage, knowing my voice, comes in. So it's one thing for students to express their opinions, but it's another to actually understand themselves as learners, especially in the educational setting. Because students can't effectively advocate for supports that they don't understand, or they can't explain why an accommodation helps if they don't know how they learn best. So this stage is all about developing self-awareness and ensuring that students are understanding their strengths, their challenges, learning about their learning preferences, and understanding the supports that help all of them succeed. So at this stage, again, students are beginning to really develop self-awareness. They learn to identify their strengths, recognize when and why they need help, understand how they learn best, and become familiar with the supports available to them. They also begin setting goals for themselves. The goal isn't for students to become experts in special education law or education law in general. It's just for students to help understand themselves well enough to explain what helps them learn and what they need to be successful. So again, just like the last stage, and what all the stages are going to show you are that there are many practice opportunities where these skills can be developed through everyday experiences. General education classrooms can build self-awareness through activities like student conferences, reflection journals, portfolios, and goal setting in general. And in special education, we can intentionally teach students about their disability, review accommodations in student-friendly language, involve students in transition assessments, and even include them in discussions about their present levels and their strengths. Because every one of these opportunities helps students better understand themselves as learners. Again, students with complex communication needs can absolutely develop self-awareness. There's no question about that. Even if they communicate differently, the goal is to ensure that every student has an accessible way to communicate who they are, how they learn best, and what helps them succeed. The key takeaway here being that knowing yourself is the foundation of advocating for yourself. So once students understand themselves as learners, they're ready for the next step, which is using that knowledge. Because it's one thing to know what helps you learn, and it's another to actually communicate that to a teacher and actually ask for an accommodation or to actually speak up when something is wrong or when something's not working. As a reminder, again, self-advocacy isn't something that students have or don't have. It's a skill that is taught and needs to be practiced and strengthened over time through those everyday experiences like we've been talking about. At this stage, students are learning to, they went from building that self-awareness in the previous stage, and now they're learning to put that self-awareness into practice. So students in this stage of using their voice are learning how to ask for help, explaining what they need, ask questions, solve problems, and participate in decisions that affect them. And notice some of these example statements that I put on the slide here. They're very simple, but just incredibly powerful in the way the language is worded. And these are the kind of skills that, prepare students not just for school, but again, for college and employment and just the rest of their lives and independent living in general. So again, these skills aren't just reserved for annual meetings. Students can practice self-advocacy throughout the school day, whether that's in classroom discussions, attendance meetings, bullying investigations, extracurricular decisions, restorative conversations. And then again, in special education, those same skills naturally carry over into IEP meetings, transition planning, behavior planning, and other educational decisions as well. Of course, self-advocacy looks different for every student. The goal isn't to change how students communicate, but to ensure that they have meaningful opportunities to advocate using the communication methods that work best for them. And the key takeaway here from this stage is that students are able to become self-advocates by practicing self-advocacy, not by watching adults advocate for them. So as students become more comfortable advocating for themselves, the next step is taking on a greater leadership role. Again, that doesn't mean every student will lead an entire meeting, and that's okay. Leadership looks different for every student. The goal here is really to help students become more confident and independent in participating in decisions about their education. So this is the final stage, like I said, and I want to emphasize one important point is that the goal isn't to create students who can just lead IEP meetings and or just lead, student conference, parent teacher conference meetings. The goal is to help students become adults who can lead their own lives with that self-determined. Self-determination, sorry, everything we've talked about so far builds towards giving students that greater independence, that confidence, and again, that self-determination that is so important for their success later in life. By this stage, students are really becoming active partners in decisions about their education. They might be able to introduce themselves, explain what helps them learn, review goals, ask questions, or even lead parts of meetings. And these same skills prepare students for, again, the post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. Leadership, of course, doesn't have to look the same for every student. Like I said, in gen ed, it might mean leading a student conference or even mentoring a younger student. In special education, it could be presenting transition goals, sharing accommodation preferences, or co-leading part of an IEP meeting. Again, the focus isn't necessarily on the activity. It's just the focus is really on just increasing their independence over time. So remember that leadership isn't about speaking the most or leading an entire meeting or being totally independent. It just, in these cases, leadership is meaning that students have meaningful choices, their perspectives are heard, and they have real influence over the decisions that are affecting them. And that's what we're ultimately trying to build here for them. So the key takeaway here is that self-advocacy, again, is a developmental process, not just one single event. And students may move through these stages at different ages and rates, depending on their strengths, methods, and needs. So with that, up to this point, we've just focused on how we can prepare students to be able to develop and use and lead with their student voice. And now we're going to shift our attention over to preparing the opportunities. So every educational interaction is an opportunity for students to practice using their voice. Student voice should, again, I've been saying this, I'm drilling it in your heads. Student voice, it should not be reserved to just one meeting a year. Or all different types of conferences or different types of places that I've got listed up here that where students can use their voice. Meaningful student participation doesn't happen by chance. It happens because adults are intentionally designing opportunities for students to participate. So throughout the rest of the section, I want you to think about these three ingredients: preparing the student, preparing the adults, and preparing the environment. Because when all three of these ingredients are in place, that's when meaningful participation and student voice becomes much more likely to happen. Too often we spend all of our energy preparing the student, and that is important. But we also forget to prepare ourselves or the meeting itself as well. And meaningful participation requires all three, like I just said, those three ingredients. The students need to know what to expect. The adults need to be intentional about gathering and using student input. And the environment should remove barriers rather than create them. So sometimes the simplest strategy is the most powerful. Ask the student. Before you make any educational decisions, just take a few minutes to ask open-ended questions, very specifically open-ended questions about what's working for the student, what's challenging, what supports do they need? Because you would be surprised how often the student provides information that nobody else in the room has. And there's no one right way or one correct way for students to be able to participate in their educational decision making. Again, the goal isn't to change the student. It's to change the way we allow participation of that student. Again, more ways for making sure that we are creating an environment. That students can feel able and empowered to use their voice. It doesn't just, again, this participation in educational decision making for students doesn't just start when a meeting starts. It starts with how we design that meeting. So even small changes, just like sharing the agenda ahead of time, using plain language, asking one question at a time, or building in breaks. Those things can make a huge difference because accessible meetings can create accessible participation. And that's really what the heart of, oh, I'm sorry, I think I froze. And hopefully that was the only time I froze this time, but really this is the heart of today's presentation. Adults do bring valuable information to the table with records, evaluations, professional judgment, of course. But students bring something that no one else can, and that's their lived experience. And when we combine all of those perspectives, that's when we can make better informed and more individualized educational decisions. So again, now we've just talked about how we can create opportunities for student voice. Now I want to take a look at what it actually looks like when those decisions are being made. How do we move students from just being discussed to actually joining the discussion? So this is really the shift we're trying to make. Instead of adults talking about the students or talking about the students, we want students to gradually become part of the conversation and hopefully lead the conversation. Again, doesn't mean that every student needs to lead a meeting. It looks different for every student, and should grow over time. But again, we want to just continue moving down that continuum to get the student to contribute and collaborate as much as possible. So meaningful participation isn't, again, just what happens during a meeting. It's just like I just talked about before. It starts before the meeting through preparation. It continues on during the discussion through introducing themselves, sharing strengths, and asking and answering questions and giving input. And then it extends beyond the meeting through reflection, review, follow-up. And of course, most importantly, that meaningful participation is also practiced between specifically scheduled meetings like an IEP meeting, for example. It's practiced between those meetings and those everyday opportunities that we've talked about that they can use to build self-advocacy skills. So really the big thing here is we need to ask better questions. Sometimes the easiest way to improve student voice is simply just asking better questions. Instead of asking things like, do you have anything to add? Or does that all sound good to you? Or do you have any questions? You have to ask more direct questions that actually invite students to share their experiences. And for the attorneys watching, open-ended questions, again, those tend to produce way more persuasive evidence than just a simple yes or no question. And again, it's all about when the decisions are being made to create a universal design for student voice. Again, instead of asking, can this student participate, ask, how can we redesign the participation so the student can meaningfully contribute? And that's exactly the mindset reflected in the laws that we discussed earlier in the presentation. It's about removing barriers so that every student has an equal opportunity to participate. So as it is with many things, in practice, student voice isn't always straightforward. When making educational decisions that affect a student, schools are usually balancing a student's preferences with parent concerns, their own professional judgment, legal obligations, and sometimes even safety or health-related considerations. So the goal isn't for student voice to control every decision. The goal is for it to be meaningfully heard and genuinely considered during that decision-making process. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. Some of the most common challenges that we see in terms of student voice are when students might decline to participate, disagree with their parents or school, have complex communication needs, or be navigating trauma or safety concerns. These situations don't by any means make student voice less important. They actually make it even more important to approach this thoughtfully. So one of the most questions I get, or one of the most common questions I get, sorry, is what if the student doesn't want to participate in the meeting? That's okay. First, ask the student why. They could be anxious or overwhelmed or just they don't know what to expect. So instead of forcing participation on a child to go to a meeting, maybe offer options like writing a letter or drawing a picture or filling out a Google form or attending just part of the meeting. Parents can also help prepare students ahead of time And educators and administrators can also normalize student participation throughout the year. Because I know part of it is sometimes you don't want to look like you're in trouble being called out of the classroom for a meeting. So normalizing that could be helpful. And attorneys and advocates can also ensure that the school document, like anytime there's a meeting, the school documents how the student participated, not simply that they refused, because sometimes it'll say student refused. Well, did they really refuse, or were they anxious and or was the meeting not accessible to them? We need our documentation to be clear. So for example, a student with anxiety may choose to submit a video and join only the last 15 minutes of the meeting. Another challenge is when students and parents disagree. Our job isn't to decide whose opinion matters more. It's to understand what each perspective tells us about the student's needs, and ensure that both voices are considered as part of that decision-making process. I just have a few examples up here that illustrate that, usually there is not one right answer here. When students and parents disagree, that really becomes kind of a school concern. And so schools there should identify what's really driving the disagreement, and clearly document the student's perspective, clearly document the parent's perspective. And then of course, talk about the legal standards and what the team's reasoning is for anything that's happened and how the final decision was reached as well. Oh,
We have
my
about 9 minutes, Renee.
Yeah, I was gonna say, sorry, my slides.
No worries.
There it goes. All right, sorry, guys. Um, so what about when students in schools disagree? A lot of times this is treated as a problem, for many different reasons, and subordination. It's schools treated as insubordination, and students see it as not being their voice not being heard. Really, when students disagree with the school, it's treated like a problem, and that's really not the best approach, because really what it is it's communication, and we need to treat it as information. So if the students in schools are disagreeing, you need to consider whether revisions are appropriate to anything. Maybe explain the reasoning behind decisions, and also make sure you document that discussion. So if a student says an accommodation isn't helping, that's an opportunity for us to learn, not something to just dismiss. That disagreement is feedback and a chance for the school to explain the decision-making process. And then for attorneys and advocates, of course, a well-documented record of the student's perspective may later become critical evidence, if that decision ends up becoming challenged later on. Again, don't let complex communication needs become a reason to exclude students from decision-making. When we shift our thinking, we can create opportunities for every student to contribute in a meaningful way. As an attorney, I cannot stress enough how important documentation is. Don't just document that the student attended, document what they actually communicated, and how it was communicated, as well as how the team responded and why the final decision was made. And really, really a practice tip that I always like to use is assume that every meeting note could someday become an exhibit in a later due process hearing or mediation or litigation at some point. Again, words matter because the words we choose can invite or shut down student participation. So small changes like replacing any questions with what's one thing you wish adults understood about school? Those small changes signal that the student's perspective is actually genuinely valued and that they're not just another student that they're passing along through. Again, asking those open-ended questions, validating before responding, and not being afraid of respectful disagreement with students is important. again, the goal of student voice isn't to make everyone agree. I wish that was possible, but it's not. It's to make sure that students are understanding the discussion that's happening and to make sure that students have that meaningful opportunity to contribute, and for them to know that their perspective was considered, and to be able to continue moving forward with developing self-advocacy skills, even if the final decision doesn't go their way. So, of course, this is where my attorney brain comes in quickly. Strong documentation, of course, captures the student's actual experience, not just that a meeting occurred. And a student's own words, of course, often become some of the strongest evidence of whether a program was truly individualized, whether supports were effective, or whether barriers remained, and other types of evidence in other areas of education. And really, when you're documenting a meeting, again, ask yourself, if these notes were to become an exhibit someday, they wouldn't be, but if they were to be, would they tell the student's story? And notice now how this brings us all full circle. Across these federal laws, documenting student voice is helping demonstrate that individualized decision-making and effective communication, meaningful participation, and fair processes. Student voice isn't a separate legal requirement itself, but really it's how schools are satisfying the legal requirements that they already have. Think about it this way. Student voice isn't just good educational practice. It's often some of the strongest evidence we have to show whether a student's educational program was truly individualized, effective, and accessible. When we are intentionally seeking out, considering, and documenting student voice, everyone benefits, especially the student. So I know I've only got a few minutes left. We've covered the why, we've covered the how, and some of the challenges. To wrap it up, I wanted to bring everything together with a couple case examples from our firm, just to show the power of student voice in action and some final key takeaways. These case examples, I'm going to skip over them since we're limited on time, but they are available in the handout. Just examples of different ways student voice has been heard. One student had made a menu to be able to communicate his preferences during an IEP meeting. Another student, and I apologize about the words here. Another student was having trouble describing her experiences with anxiety and depression at school. And so she drew a picture to show the IEP team how she was feeling. And another example was one of my students. His name was not Jalen, it's been changed for this, but one of my students during a Title IX process, one of my students with a disability during a Title IX process was given appropriate accommodations and was given an appropriate opportunity to share his student voice through being given appropriate disability accommodations. And it led to us discovering an entire second issue of, or an entire second incident of a Title IX violation. And without that ability to allow him to use his voice, we wouldn't have had that information. So really the three big takeaways that I want everyone to get from today's presentation is that, one, student voice is a skill and not just an annual event. Two, every student has a voice, and it is our responsibility to find the best way to hear it. And three, better educational decisions happen with students, not just for students. And I'll leave you with one final thought. Nothing about us without us. Whether you're a student, a parent, an educator, administrator, advocate, attorney, I hope that you will remember that student voice isn't just about speaking, and that it's about making sure students are genuinely heard. So the next time an educational decision is being made, I hope you'll ask one simple question: whose voice is missing? Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. I think Danielle's got a question that she started to answer and wanted to make sure or get your feedback on.
Okay.
Yeah, I did. I started to answer this question, but wanted to see what your thoughts were. So the student is selectively mute and uses an AAC device. Parent has tried to get the student to attend an IEP meeting or several IEP meetings, and the school has denied her
Hmm.
attendance because she uses the AAC device.
Hmm.
So, what are your thoughts on pushing for her to be able to attend her own meetings?
Well, I mean, I would look at again, it does a little bit depend on the state, but I mean, the IDEA itself, um, does allow the student to be a member of the team, especially if the student is, over that transition age. Again, depending on where you live between 14 and 16, they're required at that age and older to be invited to the IEP meeting regardless of the communication. So in this, I definitely would push back and I would go straight back to the log and that, first of all, the student can still participate in their IEP meeting, even if they communicate differently. That in itself is seeming to me more like disability discrimination than a FAPE violation if they aren't allowing her to go into participate in the meeting because of her disability. But yeah, I think the big thing is here that you do have a right to push back, and you do have the IDEA backing you that students are or should be or cannot be excluded from their IEP meeting if they are again requesting that they want to be part of the meeting or especially if they are over that transition age as well. Does
Yeah.
that help answer it?
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you. And Danielle had a good response in there too about other ways to participate other than verbally. So I think that's good. And then I'll just point out because we are at time, but Todd had a couple really good questions and Danielle had a couple really good answers. I think that are worth reading if the attendees haven't seen those yet. At the bottom of the chat, I'm sorry, bottom of the Q&A box, really good questions and answers by Todd and then Danielle. So. Thank you, Renee. That does take us to time. Everyone, before you take a break, please click on the link and complete the evaluation for Renee. And then we'll come back right at 4 o'clock for the panel discussion to end the day.